The wind had a voice out there, low, lonely, and dry as bone. It carried the smell of scorched earth and horse sweat across the Bennett Ranch, a stretch of land that had once thrived with life and laughter. Now it stood half buried in dust, the barn half collapsed, the corral gates creaking like tired lungs. Colt Bennett leaned against the porch rail, a worn hat pulled low against the sun. He was a man carved by this land, quiet, broad-shouldered, the kind who spoke little because words meant less than deeds out here. His hands were thick with calluses, his heart heavier still. He'd lost nearly everything: cattle, savings, his wife, all swallowed by drought and time. What remained were 4 children who weren't his by blood, but his by choice. They were the last living proof that even a broken man could still give something good to the world. It was near sundown when he saw her, a figure walking through the haze, moving steady though her feet dragged the dust. She didn't belong to the horizon, but she walked like someone who had wrestled it. Her dress was plain, earth-colored, and torn at the hem. Her hair, long, black, wind-tangled, shimmered like wet ink under the dying sun. When she stopped at his gate, the world went still for a breath. The crickets, the wind, even the lazy sway of the grass, all fell quiet, as if waiting. "You lost, ma'am?" Colt asked, his voice rough, not unkind. The woman shook her head once. "No, I came to ask if you'll let me teach your young ones. Reading, numbers, maybe a little decency if they'll take it." Colt squinted, studying her. There was no fear in her eyes, only weariness and something like courage, raw and thin, but real. "You a schoolteacher?" "I was," she said softly. "Before..." Her gaze dropped to her hands. "Before the war took everything I could bear." He nodded slowly, weighing her words. "You got kids of your own?" Her breath hitched, just enough for him to notice. Then she said it, plain as stone. "No, I can't have children." For a long moment, the air between them hung thick with something neither of them could name. Colt's eyes, shadowed by years of loss, softened, not in pity, but in understanding. He gave a small, crooked smile. "Good," he said finally, his voice warm as the dust settling around them. "I've got enough kids for both of us." The gate creaked open. She hesitated, just long enough for him to wonder if she'd turn back, but then she stepped through. As they crossed the yard, the last light of day caught in the strands of her hair. Behind her, the desert shimmered gold, and ahead, the sound of children's laughter drifted faintly from the barn. Colt felt something shift inside him, quiet, uncertain, but alive. He didn't know her story. He didn't know her pain, but as the first cool breath of night swept through the valley, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever storm had brought her here had also brought him a reason to hope again. The Bennett Ranch had seen its share of strangers, drifters passing through, preachers selling redemption, traders looking for feed. But none of them stayed. None of them carried that quiet, steady stillness the way Narah did. The children noticed it first. Eli, the oldest at 10, watched her like a coyote would watch the edge of a campfire, curious but wary. Finn, all knees and elbows, tripped over himself whenever she walked by, pretending he wasn't watching. Narah, soft as spring rain, studied her with the wide-eyed awe of a child seeing a story come to life. And little Lottie, who sometimes rose from her bed at night and wandered the halls in dreams, seemed to hum the same tune Narah did under her breath. At first, the house held its breath around her. The children ate in silence, their spoons scraping tin plates, eyes darting toward the quiet Apache woman who sat near the window, patching old clothes by lamplight. The desert wind whistled through the cracks in the wood, as if reminding them that she didn't belong. Not to this house, not to any man's land. But Narah didn't try to belong. She simply stayed. She swept the porch each morning before the sun broke the horizon. She hummed songs in a tongue the children didn't know. Soft, low, and full of ache. When Colt came back from the pasture, he would find her kneeling by the fire, shaping dough with care, her sleeves rolled up, her dark hair tied loosely behind her neck. She didn't ask for his help, and he didn't offer, but something about the sight made the long days less heavy. One afternoon, the children followed her outside, keeping their distance like wild ponies testing a new hand. She bent down, drew a line in the dust with a stick, and spoke without looking back. "Where I come from," she said, "our people learned before we had paper. We learned from the land, from the way a river bends, or how the stars tell when to move camp." She pressed the stick deeper into the dirt, looping shapes the kids didn't recognize. "This one," she said, "means path. This one means home. And this one," she smiled, tracing a curve that looked like the moon, "means child." The children exchanged glances. Eli, the boldest, stepped closer. "What's this one?" he asked, pointing to a swirl that looked like wind. Narah's eyes softened. "That," she said, "is the word for spirit. Every wind that touches your cheek carries someone who once loved this world." That evening, Colt came home to find all 4 children crouched in the dirt, tracing letters with sticks. Narah was there beside them, humming a low tune, her voice weaving through the dry air like smoke from a cedar fire. For the first time in years, Colt heard laughter echo off the porch, light and reckless. Narah clapped when Finn managed to spell his name. Eli tried to hide his grin when Narah praised him for drawing the cleanest E. Even Lottie, barely more than a baby, sat near Narah's skirt, pressing her tiny palms into the sand and giggling at the shapes. Inside, the kettle whistled. The smell of bread filled the room, and the house no longer felt like it was waiting for something to end. It was beginning again. That night, Colt stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the firelight flicker across the room. The kids were asleep in a pile of quilts, faces smudged with dust and dreams. Narah sat by the window, sewing a patch on Eli's torn sleeve. "Didn't think you'd get him to sit still long enough to learn anything," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "They're good children. They just forgot what safe feels like." Colt nodded, his throat tight. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind shifting through the sagebrush and the faint hum of her lullaby, the same one Lottie sometimes murmured in her sleep. And for the first time in years, Colt Bennett realized the house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was starting to sound like a home. Morning came to the Bennett ranch the way it always did, slow, gold, and gritty. A thin mist of dust drifted through the sunrise, settling over everything that still stood after years of wind and drought. Colt Bennett moved through it like clockwork. He fixed fences, fed what horses he still had, and checked the empty water troughs without saying much to anyone. Talking didn't keep cattle alive. Talking didn't stop graves from filling. He wasn't an unkind man, just one hollowed out by loss. There'd been a time when laughter lived in that house, a woman's voice, a baby's cry, but both had faded into the same hard earth that grew nothing now but sage and silence. His wife and newborn son lay beneath a lone juniper tree on the ridge, marked by a cross he'd carved himself. Colt never prayed there anymore. He'd run out of words even for God. The drought that took his herd had taken his hope with it. What kept him standing was routine, the kind that didn't leave room for remembering. He had the children to feed, a roof to patch, and a promise to keep to no one in particular but himself. Survive the day. Then another. Then another. But Narah changed the rhythm without trying to. He noticed it first when she mended Finn's torn shirt. She sat near the window, sewing with thread so fine it looked like sunlight on her fingertips. Finn leaned against her knee, talking about a frog he'd caught by the stream. Colt passed by the doorway, pretending to check the hinges. But what caught him wasn't the needle. It was the sound. Soft laughter. Hers. Later that week, he saw Narah sitting on the porch, tracing her own name in chalk. N-O-R-A, letters crooked and proud. Narah crouched beside her, patient as the land, correcting her hand with gentle touches. Colt didn't interrupt. He just stood in the yard, the taste of dust and something unfamiliar caught in his throat. That night, he poured an extra cup of coffee and left it near her place at the table. She didn't mention it, but the next morning he found the cup washed, turned upside down on the counter. No words, no thanks, but none were needed. By habit, Colt rose before dawn. The next morning he filled the kettle, stoked the fire, and left it ready before heading out. It became a quiet ritual, the kind a man like him understood. Every morning, Narah found the water hot, the coals glowing. She never asked who did it. She just smiled faintly, poured her tea, and began her day. Some evenings, after the chores were done, Colt sat outside cleaning his rifle. Through the window, he could see Narah's silhouette rocking by the hearth, the smallest child curled asleep in her lap. Her hum, that same low tune she always sang, drifted out through the cracks in the wall. Colt closed his eyes. It wasn't a prayer, not exactly, but the sound filled the empty corners of the house the way rain fills a dry well. He'd never been a man of words, and he sure as hell wasn't one for flowers or fine gestures. But that kettle on the stove each morning, that was his way of saying thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for reminding me what warmth sounds like. And as the moon climbed over the desert ridge, pale as worn silver, Colt Bennett sat alone on his porch, hat tipped low, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace, learning how to come home again. By late autumn, the talk had started, the kind that rode into town faster than the stagecoach. Folks at the general store leaned close over their barrels of nails and sacks of flour, whispering, "You heard about Bennett? Took in one of them Apache women. Lives with her under the same roof." In a place like Laramie Flats, where the church bell ruled harder than any sheriff, gossip could gut a man's name quicker than a rattlesnake's strike. But Colt Bennett didn't give it breath. He'd learned long ago that a man couldn't live by other people's tongues. What he did care about was the sound inside his own house, the laughter of children, the scrape of Narah's chair against the wooden floor, the gentle hum of her voice as she worked by lamplight. It had been years since the place felt alive, and he'd be damned if anyone's opinion changed that. Still, the stares followed him whenever he rode into town. A few men spat in the dirt by his boots. One woman crossed herself when Narah's name was mentioned. Colt met it all with the same quiet steel, eyes straight ahead, jaw set, hands steady on the reins. That night, as the desert sky stretched black and endless, Colt sat out on the porch, boots propped on the railing, nursing a cup of bitter coffee. From inside came the soft rhythm of Narah's singing, not in English but in the old Apache tongue, a sound like wind moving through pine. The children listened by the hearth. Narah leaned against Narah's shoulder. Finn's eyelids drooped. Even Eli, ever guarded, had stopped pretending he wasn't listening. And Lottie, sweet little Lottie, hummed along, eyes half closed. Later, when the fire burned low and the house slipped into sleep, Colt saw movement through the window. Lottie, barefoot, pale as moonlight, had wandered out the front door. He set down his cup and rose, but before he reached her, Narah was already there. She crossed the yard in silence, her shawl trailing behind her, her steps sure as if she'd walked that path 100 times. She knelt beside the child, gathering her into her arms. Lottie didn't wake. She simply nestled into Narah's chest, sighing like she'd found her mother again. Then Narah began to sing. The melody was low and haunting, the kind that could tame both storm and sorrow. Colt stood in the shadows, unable to move, the oil lamp flickering behind him. Her voice floated up into the night, a prayer older than any church hymn, words shaped by earth and fire. The desert wind carried it across the pasture, through the fences, into the sleeping fields. For a long moment, Colt forgot the ranch, the drought, the graves on the hill. All he could feel was the ache of something long buried breaking open inside him. When Narah finally turned, her eyes caught the lantern light. She didn't startle, didn't explain. She only gave a faint nod, still holding the child. Colt's hat brim hid his expression, but in the glow of that oil flame, something softened. He'd seen miracles before, the kind born of storms breaking, or a calf surviving its first night in the cold. But this was different. This was quiet magic, the kind that didn't ask to be believed, only witnessed. And standing there under a sky stitched with stars, Colt Bennett, the man who'd buried his faith years ago, found himself believing again. It was near noon when the stranger rode in, a man in a dark coat and a hat too clean for the trail. His horse kicked up dust as he pulled to a stop at the gate, the glint of a badge flashing from beneath his jacket. The air that day was still, heavy with the scent of sun-baked sage and the faint crackle of something about to break. Colt Bennett stepped off the porch, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're a long way from Cheyenne," he said, his voice flat as dry earth. The man nodded, dismounting. "Name's Turner, Territorial Welfare Office." He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a folded paper, the red seal pressed sharp against its surface. "I'm afraid this isn't a friendly visit." Narah stood at the doorway, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, the children peering out from behind her legs. Turner cleared his throat, reading in a tone stripped of mercy. "Mr. Bennett, it's come to the office's attention that 4 minors reside under your care, none of whom share your surname or legal guardianship. By law, they are to be relocated to the Cheyenne orphanage within 10 days. The words hit harder than any bullet. Colt's jaw tightened, his eyes flicked from the man to the children, Eli's defiant stare, Finn's trembling chin, Norah's pale confusion, and Lottie's small hand clutching Narah's dress. "I'm not handing them over," Colt said quietly. Turner sighed, already mounting his horse. "It's not a matter of choice, sir. Papers don't lie." As the official rode away, the dust behind him curled like smoke from a dying fire. That night, the ranch was silent. Even the crickets seemed to have lost their courage. Colt sat on the porch steps, the folded paper in his hands, creased and damp from his grip. The lamp beside him flickered weakly. Narah came out, the faint smell of cedar following her. She didn't speak at first. She simply sat beside him, her presence calm, steady, like the hum of wind before dawn. He finally broke the silence. "They'll take them," he said, voice low. "They'll come here and load them into wagons like stray calves." He stared out into the dark. "Truth is, I ain't their father. Not by blood, not by law." He paused, the memories cutting through him like barbed wire. Eli I found after a barn fire. His folks never made it out. Narah was left at the church steps in a storm. Finn's ma died when the fever came through last spring. And Lottie. Her daddy swung for horse theft. She was 2 months old, crying in the jailhouse when they asked me to take her. Narah listened, eyes reflecting the dim glow of the lantern. When he finished, she laid her hand gently over his. Rough, scarred, still trembling. You didn't make them, she said softly, but you saved them. And that's what makes a man a father, Colt. He swallowed hard. The paper in his hand crumpled as he spoke. Law don't see it that way. Then we'll make them see, she replied, simple as prayer. We'll fight, with truth, not ink. Her voice carried a weight he couldn't argue with. Inside, the children lay awake, whispering in the dark. They didn't know the law's words, but they knew fear when it settled in the walls. Yet when Narah tucked them in, her hand gentle on each brow, her voice was certain. No one's taking you anywhere, she said. Outside, Colt stood under the cold wash of moonlight, the stamped paper burning in his pocket like a brand. For the first time in years, the man who'd sworn never to hope felt something close to it. Because now, it wasn't just his fight. It was theirs. The wind came first, a low, moaning sound that crawled down the valley like something alive. Then came the rain, hard and cold, slapping against the roof until it sounded like the heavens themselves were splitting apart. By nightfall, the Bennett ranch was a blur of mud and thunder. The barn doors rattled, and the horses screamed in their stalls. Inside, Narah pressed her palm to Lottie's forehead. The little girl's skin burned hotter than the fire, her breaths short and shallow. Colt! Narah's voice cut through the storm. She's not waking. Colt was already moving, boots pounding across the floorboards. He knelt beside the bed, brushing the damp hair from Lottie's face. Her tiny hand hung limp in his own. He'd seen men die of fever, of snakebite, of gunshot wounds. But this helplessness felt worse than all of it. He looked at Narah, her dark eyes wide and desperate in the flickering lamplight. How long? Since sundown, she said. She's slipping, Colt. He didn't hesitate. I'll fetch Doc Avery. He's over in Mason's Hollow. Narah grabbed his arm. The river's risen. You can't cross it now. I have to. His voice was steady, but his jaw clenched tight. That little girl calls me Pa. That's reason enough. She didn't argue. She only reached for his coat, buttoning it with trembling fingers. When her hand brushed his chest, he caught it, just for a second. No words, just that touch. Then he was gone, into the rain. The door slammed shut behind him, and the storm swallowed him whole. Out in the valley, the world had turned to chaos. The sky tore open with lightning, and the river, usually a lazy brown thread, had become a roaring beast. Colt spurred his horse, the animal snorting foam, hooves sinking deep into the mud. The water hit them like fists, icy and wild. He leaned forward, yelling against the wind. Come on, boy, come on! The horse plunged through the current, muscles straining. For a moment, Colt thought they'd both go under, but somehow they didn't. Somehow the animal found footing, and they climbed the far bank, soaked, shaking, but alive. By the time he reached Doc Avery's cabin, the lantern light inside looked like salvation. Lottie's burning up, Colt barked, barely able to breathe. Please, Doc, now. The old man didn't waste a word. Within minutes, they were galloping back into the storm, Colt leading the way, his soaked hat plastered to his head. Hours later, though it felt like years, the ranch lights came into view. Narah was still at the bedside, whispering to Lottie in Apache, a prayer or maybe a promise. When Colt stumbled in, Dripping wet, she looked up, eyes wide with relief and disbelief all at once. Doc Avery pushed past them, unpacking his satchel. The next few hours blurred into feverish murmurs and cold cloths. Narah never left the child's side. Colt stood by the door, hands shaking, powerless but present, a sentry against the dark. Then, sometime before dawn, Lottie stirred. Her lips parted, and a weak sound slipped out. Pa. It broke him. Colt dropped to his knees beside the bed, covering his face with one hand as the other clung to hers. He wasn't a man given to tears. But that word, that single word, cracked something open deep inside. When Doc finally packed his things and left, the storm had passed. The world outside glistened with morning. Narah sat back, exhaustion softening her every feature. Colt turned toward her, still trembling. "She'll make it," he said, his voice raw. Narah nodded. Her eyes filled, though she smiled through it. "You brought her back?" Colt shook his head. "No. We did. And for the first time since the war, since the graves, since the drought, Narah wept. Not from fear, but from something stronger, deeper, because somewhere between thunder and silence, she had found it. A home. The storm left the valley bruised and quiet. Fences were down. The river had swallowed half the pasture, and the air still smelled of rain and smoke. Yet inside the Bennett ranch, there was peace. The fever had broken. Lottie slept soundly, her small chest rising and falling beneath Narah's hand. For the first time in weeks, Colt Bennett slept too. Not the shallow kind that comes from exhaustion, but the deep, bone-heavy sleep of a man who'd fought for something worth keeping. By sunrise, the sound of hoofbeats stirred the yard. Colt was already at the porch, coffee in hand, when two riders appeared over the ridge, the same official from Cheyenne and a deputy beside him. The sun caught the badge on the man's vest, throwing it like a flash of judgment across the wet ground. Colt's gut tightened. He didn't need to ask why they'd come. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," the officer called as he dismounted. His tone was different this time. Less steel, more sand. "We've had developments." Narah stepped out behind Colt, her hair still damp, the shawl slipping from her shoulders. The children huddled near the door, silent but wide-eyed. The deputy cleared his throat, fumbling with a sealed envelope marked with the state's crest. "By order of the Wyoming Territorial Office," the man began, voice steady but softer than before. "The relocation order for the miners residing at the Bennett Ranch is hereby rescinded." Colt blinked. "Rescinded?" "Yes, sir." The man unfolded another page. "Seems we got ourselves a petition, signed by near every soul in town. Even the pastor, the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, and a few names I couldn't read for the dust. It says here that these children belong right where they are, with you and the lady." He glanced at Narah when he said it, then back down at the page. "They wrote things too. Bennett's the only father they've known. The Apache woman teaches our kids. She's more mother than the law could make her." The words hung in the morning air, fragile and powerful all at once. Colt took the letter, his rough fingers trembling as he unfolded it. Dozens of signatures filled the page, each one a little act of rebellion against cold ink and colder laws. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, finally, his voice cracked through the quiet. "Well," he muttered, eyes on the children. "Guess the town's got more sense than I gave it credit for." The official tipped his hat. "Sometimes, Mr. Bennett, the law just needs a nudge from the people who still remember what right looks like." When they rode away, the dust from their horses rose into a sky clean and blue again. The valley seemed to breathe. Narah turned to him, her expression unreadable. Colt looked back, the morning light catching in his eyes. Not pride, not relief, but something deeper. Gratitude. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Behind them, Narah laughed as Finn tried to chase a chicken across the yard. Eli shouted something about breakfast, and Lottie, still pale but smiling, called out for Pa. The sound wrapped around them like sunlight. From that day on, the Bennett Ranch wasn't just a patch of land or a house held together by nails and prayer. It was home, rough-edged, imperfect, but real. The town still whispered, of course. They always would. But now, when Colt rode into town for feed or tools, men nodded instead of staring. Women waved. The blacksmith clapped him on the shoulder. And every night, when the lamps were blown out and the desert stars came alive overhead, Colt would glance across the room to where Narah sat reading to the children. He no longer thought of her as the Apache woman. She was family, the kind that life gives you when the world takes everything else. Winter came hard that year, the kind that didn't just bite, it buried. The Bennett Ranch lay under a blanket of white so deep the fences vanished. The corral posts looked like gravestones, and the sky itself seemed frozen in place. For days, the snow fell without mercy, piling against the windows until the light inside turned gray and still. The stove crackled from dawn till dusk, fed by every scrap of wood they could find. But supplies were running low, and the cold had a way of testing both a man's strength and his spirit. Colt Bennett had seen harsh winters before, but never one this mean. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the wind crept through the seams of the house like a thief. When the last of the firewood was down to splinters, he knew there was no waiting. "I'll take Eli," he told Narah, pulling on his coat. "We'll bring back enough wood to last till thaw." Narah frowned, her dark eyes catching the firelight. "The drifts are too deep. You'll lose the trail before you reach the ridge." He gave her a half smile, tired but sure. "You keep the fire going. We'll be back before it dies." Eli, tall for his age but still a boy, followed close behind as they disappeared into the storm. The world outside was a blur of white, sky and ground melting together. The wind screamed through the cottonwoods, erasing their tracks as fast as they could make them. Hours passed. The wood was wet and stubborn, but they gathered what they could, bundling it tight with rope. When they turned for home, the snow was falling harder, slicing sideways through the air. "Pa, I can't see the house," Eli shouted over the wind. "Keep close, boy," Colt called back, gripping his arm. Every breath burned. Every step felt heavier. The world had shrunk to noise and cold and fear. Somewhere between the ridge and the creek, the horse stumbled, throwing them both into the drift. Colt pulled Eli up, his arms shaking from the cold. He could barely feel his fingers. The storm roared louder, a wall of sound and fury. He didn't pray often, but right then, he did. Not for himself, for the boy, for home, for warmth. And then, faint as memory, a light appeared through the blizzard. A flicker, small, golden, impossibly distant. "Look," Eli gasped. The lantern, Narah's lantern. She had come out into the storm, the flame held high, her shawl whipping in the wind. She called their names, her voice thin but fierce. "Colt! Eli!" He pushed forward with what little strength he had left, following the sound of her voice like it was the last thing tethering him to the world. When they reached her, Colt nearly fell to his knees. Narah dropped the lantern and wrapped her arms around Eli first, then Colt, pulling them both close against her. "Don't you ever do that again," she whispered, her words breaking against his coat. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper. "I thought I'd lost you." Colt's breath came hard, the air clouding between them. He pressed his forehead to hers, his hand cupping the back of her neck. "I was lost," he murmured, "but I found my way home." Inside, the fire still burned, its glow dancing across the wooden walls. The children were asleep under quilts, unaware of how close the night had come to stealing more than heat. Narah guided Colt to a chair, stripping off his frozen coat. His hands were blue at the knuckles, his breath uneven. She knelt beside him, rubbing warmth back into his fingers, her hair falling loose across her shoulders. When he finally caught his breath, he reached out, rough palm brushing her cheek. "I didn't have a place to come back to," he said softly. "Not until you." The words hung between them, fragile as glass, real as the heartbeat beneath her hand. And there, in that small kitchen filled with the scent of smoke and melting snow, Colt Bennett and Narah didn't speak another word. They didn't need to. The silence said enough, that somewhere between storm and firelight, two broken souls had found peace in each other. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside the Bennett ranch, winter had finally learned how to be gentle. Spring came slow that year, cautious, like it wasn't sure it was welcome after the winter's cruelty. The snow melted into the soil, turning the fields to rivers of mud. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the valley finally breathed again. The Bennett ranch wore its scars proudly, a few broken fence rails, a roof patch darker than the rest. But there was life inside those walls. Children's laughter drifted across the yard, mingling with the low hum of Narah's voice as she hung laundry in the soft morning light. Colt watched from the porch, coffee in hand, his hat tilted low. The sight never failed to still him. The way the wind played with her hair, the way she turned when the children called her name. It stirred something deeper than peace, something he'd long thought buried with the past. That night, after the chores were done and the lamps were dim, the house settled into its rhythm. The creak of the old boards, the distant bark of coyotes, the steady crackle of fire. Colt sat near the hearth, mending the handle of his saddle. Narah sat across from him, sewing a new shirt for Eli. For a while, neither spoke. Words out here were like bullets, better saved for when they mattered. Then Colt set his work aside. His voice came low, almost lost to the hiss of the fire. "You know," he said, "a man could go his whole life without saying what needs saying, and by the time he tries, it's too late." Narah looked up, her needle pausing mid-air. "What is it you're trying to say, Colt?" He drew a slow breath, staring into the flames as if searching for courage there. "You told me once you can't have children." Her eyes flickered, the old hurt briefly shadowing her face. "Yes," she whispered. "I did." He nodded. "Well, I reckon that doesn't matter much. Because you've been more of a mother than most women ever dreamed to be, you've given those kids something I never could." She blinked, unsure how to answer. "And what's that?" "Peace," he said simply. "A home that feels like one." The room fell quiet again, save for the steady crackle of the fire. Colt's hands tightened on his knees. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the kind that wasn't from the flames. He turned toward her, his voice steady but rough. "Don't just teach them anymore, Narah. Stay. Be their mother." Her breath caught, and before she could speak, he added softly, "Be my wife, too." It wasn't a grand proposal, not the kind written in poems or sung beneath balconies. There was no ring, no witness, just a man who'd spent half his life running from ghosts finally daring to stand still. Narah stared at him, her dark eyes shimmering with the fire's reflection. For a heartbeat, She said nothing. Then she set her sewing aside, crossed the space between them, and knelt by his chair. Her fingers brushed his cheek, rough with days of work and weather. "You don't need to promise me anything," she whispered. "Just keep coming home." Colt's throat tightened. "That I can do." She smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and grace, and leaned her forehead against his. Outside, the wind swept softly across the plains, warm and new. The fire crackled lower, and the house breathed with them. Two broken souls who'd learned to build something whole from the pieces. No vows, no ceremony, just truth, spoken in the quiet language of the West. Where love didn't shout, it simply stayed. Spring returned to the Bennett Ranch like a long-lost friend. The snow melted into the thirsty soil, turning it soft and rich, and wildflowers climbed the fence line in colors too bright for memory. The big oak behind the house, the one that had survived every drought, every storm, was in full leaf again. Under that tree, life began anew. The wedding wasn't grand. Nothing ever was out here. There were no fine linens, no polished pews, just neighbors who came on horseback, faces weathered by the same sun and wind. The preacher from Laramie read from a book whose edges were curled with dust. Eli stood proud in a shirt Narah had stitched herself. Norah carried a basket of yellow blooms. Finn held tight to the hem of Colt's coat, and Lottie, still small but strong again, scattered wild daisies like stars at their feet. Someone brought whiskey. Someone else brought pie. And when Narah stepped from the house, the whole valley seemed to go still. The afternoon light caught in her hair, warm as honey. Her dress wasn't white. It was cream and hand-sewn, the hem brushed with the same red clay that had carried her here. Colt waited beneath the oak, hat in hand, boots sunk deep in the soft earth. When she reached him, he didn't speak right away. His throat worked against words that felt too small for what they meant. Then, quietly, he said, "I can't promise you much, Narah. Not gold, not comfort, not an easy road. But I can promise that every sunrise, you'll know you're loved." Narah's eyes glistened as the wind stirred the leaves above them. "That's all I ever asked," she whispered. The preacher cleared his throat, smiled, and said the words that made it true. There was no ring, just the touch of their hands. Hers small and strong, his rough and certain. When he kissed her, the crowd cheered, and somewhere in that chorus of laughter and wind and children's voices, the ghosts of the past seemed to finally let go. As the sun dipped low, the celebration spilled across the yard. The neighbors played fiddle tunes, and the children danced barefoot in the grass. Even the horses lifted their heads from the troughs, ears twitching toward the music. Later, when the crowd had gone and the stars had settled over the ranch like a blanket, Colt and Narah sat beneath the oak, the lantern between them flickering against the dark. "You know," he said softly, watching the horizon fade into silver, "this land's seen more loss than any man should bear. But somehow, it keeps growing things. Wildflowers, children, love. Guess that's what makes it holy." Narah leaned her head on his shoulder, smiling. "It's not the land, Colt. It's the people who stay." He looked at her, the woman who had walked out of the desert and built him a home without walls. "Then we'll stay," he murmured, "as long as the wind lets us." The night was still, save for the whisper of branches overhead, an old oak bearing witness to two souls who had chosen each other, not by law or blood, but by heart. And for anyone passing through those wide Wyoming plains, the Bennett Ranch became more than just a mark on the map. It became a story, the kind told beside campfires, about a cowboy and an Apache woman who taught a town what family really means. Family isn't who you're born to, it's who stays when the storm hits. So, if you were riding across that land and saw a light glowing warm beneath an old oak, what would you do? Ride on into the night? Or stop long enough to remember that love, out here, is the only thing that ever survives?